January 17, 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The morning air hung thick with the smell of cordite and rotting vegetation. Lieutenant Colonel Takeshi Matsuda stood in what remained of a command bunker. Little more there. Splintered palm logs and mud now, staring at a piece of paper that trembled in his hands. Not from fear, though fear had become familiar, but from the sheer impossibility of what he had witnessed in the preceding 72 hours. Around him, the jungle that had once provided cover now stood shattered, trees reduced to jagged stumps, the earth itself seeming to have been turned inside out by some terrible mechanical god. He had been ordered to file a combat report. Standard procedure, expected within 6 hours of major engagement. But Matsuda would do something almost unthinkable in the Imperial Japanese Army. He would request a delay, not for a day, not for a week, but indefinitely. This was not an isolated incident. In the dark mathematics of the Pacific War, a pattern emerged that military historians would spend decades attempting to fully comprehend. Japanese field commanders, officers trained in the rigid traditions of Bushido and absolute obedience, began systematically requesting delays in filing after-action reports following direct engagement with American forces. Some requests were denied. Others were quietly accepted by superiors who understood what those reports would contain. What could drive an officer corps renowned for its discipline and devotion to emperor to such an extraordinary breach of protocol? The answer lay not in cowardice, but in something far more psychologically complex: the complete collapse of the operational reality they had been promised. When Japan struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Imperial General Headquarters had calculated the conflict with ruthless precision. American industrial capacity was known. Certainly factories and production lines could be counted, tabulated, reduced to numbers on planning documents. But numbers on paper possessed no psychological weight. Japanese military doctrine, forged in conflicts against terrorist Russia and warlord China, had developed a philosophy wherein spirit Saishin could overcome material disadvantage. This was not mere propaganda. It was embedded in training, in tactical doctrine, in the very soul of the officer corps. The Americans, they had been assured, were soft. A nation grown fat on luxury and individualism, a democracy where discipline was optional and sacrifice foreign. They would produce, yes, but they would not endure. One decisive blow, perhaps two, and the decadent giant would seek peace. Matsuda had believed this. Most of them had. He remembered the briefing in Manila, October 1942, before his battalion deployed to the Solomons. Charts showing American merchant ship losses, optimistic assessments of defensive positions, assurances that air superiority would be maintained, that resupply would continue, that Tokyo understood the strategic importance of every position. Guadalcanal, they were told, was a statement. Hold it, and the Americans would understand the cost of advancing across the Pacific, make them bleed for every island, every beachhead, and their democracy would fracture under the weight of casualties and economic strain. The reality that crashed down upon Japanese forces in those early months of 1943 bore no resemblance to the promises. It began with the artillery. Not the volume, though, that was overwhelming, but the consistency. Japanese doctrine emphasized mobility, surprise, concentrated force applied at decisive points. Artillery was supportive, rationed, each shell a precious resource to be husbanded and employed with precision. The Americans used artillery like rain. Matsuda's unit had weathered bombardments that lasted not minutes but hours, sometimes an entire day, shells falling in such density that the jungle canopy simply ceased to exist, replaced by a gray-brown fog of pulverized earth and shredded wood. His men had dug deeper, reinforced positions, prayed to ancestors. It made no difference. The Americans would pause long enough for desperate hope to kindle, then resume with undiminished intensity, as if the shells themselves cost nothing, as if there existed, somewhere across that ocean, factories producing them faster than they could possibly be fired. Then came the realization about food. This was perhaps the most psychologically devastating discovery, though it took time to fully comprehend. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific operated on rice rations, supplemented where possible by local foraging, fishing, occasionally captured supplies. Hunger was expected. It was part of the warrior's endurance. Medical officers noted declining body weight, increasing cases of beriberi and malnutrition, but these were accepted costs. The Americans, however, existed in a different nutritional universe entirely. Matsuda's men had overrun a hastily abandoned American position in early December before the full offensive began. What they found was beyond comprehension. Cases, not packages, but wooden cases of tinned meat. Cigarettes by the carton, chocolate bars wrapped in waxed paper, coffee, powdered milk, preserved fruit. One soldier discovered a crate containing nothing but chewing gum, hundreds of small foil-wrapped packets. Another found medical supplies, sulfur drugs, morphine syringes, bandages of a quality superior to what Japanese field hospitals possessed. This was a forward position, not a rear depot. Not a supply hub, a fighting position occupied by perhaps 40 men for less than 3 days. The psychological impact was immediate and corrosive. If this abundance existed at the very edge of American logistics, what did the rear areas contain? What were the men firing those shells eating? These questions gnawed at assumptions more effectively than any propaganda could. The American soldier, they realized, was not fighting at the edge of his nation's capacity. He was fighting with surplus, with waste even. Japanese intelligence officers documented captured supply manifests that showed regular delivery of ice cream making machines, recreational equipment, entire portable theaters. This was not an economy straining under war's demands. This was an economy casually, almost carelessly, projecting power across 6,000 miles of ocean. But material abundance alone does not explain the phenomenon of delayed reports. It was the integration of that material superiority with doctrine and technology that proved so psychologically devastating. American forces fought in a manner that seemed to violate the base principles of ground combat as Japanese officers understood them. Traditional infantry tactics, maneuver, infiltration, night attacks where Japanese units excelled became nearly impossible against an enemy that refused to fight on those terms. The Americans brought overwhelming firepower to every engagement, often refusing to close to the ranges where Japanese training and fighting spirit might matter. They coordinated artillery, naval gunfire, and air support with a speed and precision that suggested not merely good training but some fundamental difference in organizational philosophy. Radio communication, rare and precious in Japanese units, appeared universal in American formations down to the company level. Every observer could call in fire support. Every unit seemed connected to an invisible network of supporting arms. Combat reports in the Japanese military system served multiple purposes beyond simple documentation. They were tactical assessments, certainly, but also moral documents. They demonstrated courage, honored sacrifice, maintained the narrative of imperial invincibility. An officer filing a report was expected to frame defeats in terms of honorable resistance, temporary setbacks, heroic last stands. This was possible when fighting followed comprehensible patterns, outnumbered, outflanked, overcome by superior tactics. But how does one frame utter material inadequacy within a doctrine that prizes spirit over steel? How does a commander explain to headquarters that his men who would charge machine guns without hesitation, were never permitted to close within charging range because American doctrine simply refused that form of combat? How does one report that positions carefully prepared over weeks were rendered irrelevant, not by superior tactic, but by the casual expenditure of munitions in quantities that seemed to mock the very concept of logistics? The truth was unspeakable because it undermined everything. Matsuda knew that his report, if filed honestly, would arrive in Tokyo where staff officers who had never heard an American artillery barrage would read it with skepticism. They would see excuses. They would question his courage, his competence, perhaps his loyalty. Worse, if believed, it might contribute to a larger narrative that Tokyo was not prepared to accept. In early 1943, that the fundamental calculus of the war had been catastrophically wrong, that American productive capacity was not merely superior but existed on a scale that rendered Japanese strategy obsolete, that democracy, far from making a nation weak, had mobilized resources with an efficiency the empire could not match. So the requests came. Delay the report pending clarification. Delay pending reorganization. Delay pending further engagement to provide complete picture. Some commanders never filed complete after-action reports from Guadalcanal, New Guinea, the Gilberts. Their silence spoke volumes that words could not safely convey. There was something else, too, something that appeared in private journals and letters that would not be discovered until after the war. American troops, when captured or when bodies were examined, carried personal items that revealed a glimpse of the society producing them. Photographs of automobiles, not just any automobiles, but personal vehicles owned by common soldiers. Letters referencing indoor plumbing, electric appliances, educational opportunities. These were not aristocrats. These were farmers' sons and factory workers, yet they came from a material abundance that exceeded what most Japanese officers experienced. One intelligence analysis noted that the average American private possessed better boots than those issued to Japanese company commanders. The canteen attached to every American soldier's belt held more water than most Japanese squads carried collectively. Such disparities seemed almost designed to mock the notion of spiritual superiority overcoming material disadvantage. By mid-1943, some Japanese commanders began filing reports that focused almost exclusively on American material superiority, perhaps as a defensive measure, perhaps as a desperate attempt to convey reality to Tokyo. These reports took on an almost obsessive quality, cataloging American equipment with the precision of men trying to solve an impossible equation. If we can just make them understand the scale, the reports seem to say, they will recognize that defeat here reflects no dishonor. One report from New Georgia detailed an American logistics base that contained, among other things, complete dental facilities, refrigerated morgue units, mobile laundries, and a lending library with several thousand books. The Japanese officer filing the report noted, with something approaching awe, that this base was considered temporary and would be abandoned once the advance moved forward. The symbolic weight of American abundance crystallized around a single item that appeared with such regularity in Japanese accounts that it demands examination: the sea ration. These small tins of preserved food, mundane to American soldiers, became talismans of industrial might to their opponents. Each ration represented a complex supply chain: farming, processing, canning, packaging, transportation across an ocean, distribution to individual soldiers. Japanese forces, struggling to maintain rice supplies over a few hundred miles, confronted an enemy who treated complete meals in individual portions as disposable field rations. The sea ration became a psychological weapon more devastating than any artillery shell because it was evidence of capacity. It said, we can afford to give every soldier food that requires no preparation, needs no refrigeration, comes in its own disposal container, and we can do this for millions of men across the entire Pacific. What can you afford? As 1943 turned to 1944 and the American advance accelerated, the delayed reports took on new characteristics. Some commanders stopped requesting delays and simply filed reports so vague as to be useless, encountered strong resistance, withdrew in good order. Others filed reports that read more like philosophical meditations on the nature of modern war than tactical documents. A few, most notably after the fall of Saipan, filed reports that could only be described as pleas. This is not a question of courage, tactics, these reports insisted, but of fighting an enemy whose homeland produces more in a day than our empire produces in a month. Tokyo's response was telling. Some reports were classified immediately, their contents deemed harmful to morale. Others were simply ignored, filed away with no command response. A few were returned with notations suggesting the reporting officer had suffered nervous strain and should be evaluated by medical personnel. The system itself could not accommodate the truth those reports contained. There exists a photograph taken by an American Marine on Peleliu in September 1944. It shows a captured Japanese command post, partially destroyed by naval gunfire. Scattered among the debris are papers, maps, orders, and several action reports, some partially completed, others torn in half. One report, still legible despite mud and shrapnel damage, describes an American attack with clinical precision bombardment, lasting 4 hours, estimated 3,000 shells, followed by armor advance, followed by infantry with integral mortar and machine gun support, followed by immediate resupply visible in the rear area. The report ends mid-sentence, as if the officer filing it simply could not continue. Whether this was due to the attack itself or the psychological impossibility of the task is unclear. The epilogue to this phenomenon came after the war, when captured documents and interrogation revealed the full scope of what historians would call the report problem. Japanese officers, speaking with brutal honesty in captivity, acknowledged that by mid-1944, accurate combat reporting had largely ceased in many formations, not because officers were cowards, but because the institutional framework could not process the information they needed to convey. The gap between doctrine and reality had grown so vast that the language of military reports could not bridge it. How do you tell your superiors that the enemy is not defeating you tactically, but simply erasing your positions through material application? That courage, discipline, and tactical skill, all the virtues the Imperial Army prized, had been rendered largely irrelevant by an opponent who fought according to entirely different principles. In the end, the delayed reports stand as testament not to any moral failure, but to the crushing psychological weight of facing an enemy whose capacities seemed to have no ceiling, whose logistics appeared immune to the normal constraints of war, whose individual soldiers went into battle carrying more material wealth than many Japanese officers would see in a lifetime. These were men confronting a truth that their entire military culture had not prepared them for. That spirit, however strong, cannot overcome the focused productive output of a fully mobilized industrial democracy. That abundance, far from making a nation soft, provided the foundation for a way of war that was comprehensive, relentless, and ultimately unstoppable. Lieutenant Colonel Matsuda never did file his report from Guadalcanal. He was evacuated during the final withdrawal, suffering from malnutrition and exhaustion. He survived the war, and in 1952 wrote a memoir that included a chapter on those 72 hours. In it, he described standing in that shattered bunker, report form in hand, searching for words that would not come. He realized, he wrote, that he was not fighting an army. He was fighting a factory, and the factory was winning.